I'm Jen. Everyone in attendance, I think, knows me, so it's really nice to see you. I realized when I put the description of this study in the program, we'd been told to make it exciting, and I made it exciting to me, but probably nobody else, so thank you so much for being here. This is basically my dissertation research that I'm going to talk about today, and so it's a study that I did that was part of a larger IES-funded study at the University of Maryland, and the PIs of that study were Rebecca Silverman and Patrick Proctor, and I was their doctoral student. And so they allowed me to collect data with them and then to collect my own data as well. And so the study I'm going to talk about today includes sort of the use of their big data set and then a data set that I collected from teachers. So they had student data, I was looking at teacher data and comparing the two together. And so what I really wanted to know was what was happening in classrooms, because sort of the target population of the larger study was schools that had classrooms that had students that were language minority learners, or ELLs. We called them LMLs because of the way that they defined what that means. They basically said anybody who speaks a language other than English at home is an LML, a language minority learner, and so that's the term we used because that's the term that they used. But they were looking for students who were in classrooms where at least 20% of the population of the classroom were students who spoke a language other than English at home, but the mainstream classroom teacher wasn't necessarily trained. In fact, I don't think in any cases we're trained in teaching ELL. So we wanted to know what's happening in that classroom and what sorts of things are impacting how those language minority learners do in the classroom. And so I looked specifically at teacher factors, things like had they had any training in working with ELLs or language minority learners, and I was even more specifically interested in their beliefs and attitudes related to language minority learners. So how did they feel, good morning, how did they feel about having those students in their classroom? And how did they feel about modifying their instruction to meet those students' needs? And so those were the kinds of questions that I was asking. And then I took the data from the survey that I gave to the teachers and compared it to the data from the students to see if there were differences in outcomes based on these beliefs and attitudes and background factors of the teacher. So that was our study, and we found some pretty interesting things. I'll tell you a little bit more about the populations we were looking at and then a little bit about our findings. And I would love to get your feedback. We're getting ready to send this out for publication, so very selfishly, I would love to pick your brain a little bit and see what you think about this and see if there are some things that I should add, or it's not a perfect study. I know of some of the major flaws in it, but it's one of those things where I've looked at it so long that I'm sure there are things that I can't even see anymore. So I really appreciate your time and your help. Okay, so when I went to the literature to see what it said, I found that there was quite a bit of research where people were looking at relationships between teacher background factors like years of training, just years of schooling in general, and things like that, but they hadn't actually looked at, they hadn't broken their data out to reflect how that impacted ELLs or language minority learners specifically. They looked at special ed, they looked at struggling learners, but they hadn't actually ever, that I could find, talked about how this impacted ELL students or language minority learners. And so there was also a big body of research that I found that was talking about teachers' beliefs and attitudes related to having language minority learners in their classrooms, but they didn't actually compare those attitudes to classroom outcomes. So there seemed to be this sort of gap in the research base, and that's what I was trying to address. And so that's what I did with my study, or tried to do, was to look at relationships that might exist between what the teachers felt and how the teachers had been prepared to work with their students and how their students did. And the larger study that I was working with was looking specifically at literacy outcomes because those seem to be most directly tied to the students' linguistic background. And so I compared their sort of outcomes on measures of vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension. And so we used the Woodcock-Munoz language survey, the passage comprehension and vocabulary subtests, and the teachers took a survey. And so I was asking them all kinds of different questions. The first one just being, how long have you been a teacher? Academic achievement was the term that we used to describe how much schooling had they had. So did they have a bachelor's degree, master's degree, beyond that? And then I had questions that were related to the inclusion of language minority learners in their classrooms. How did they feel about it? In both of the school districts where we were working, those students had been mainstreamed into general education classrooms fairly recently, and teachers had mixed feelings about it. And then How did they feel about literacy instruction for language minority learners? Did they feel that those students should have instruction that included their home language? Did they feel that any modifications should be made, or did they feel that those students should just access the content the way they were presenting it to everybody else? And then I also asked them questions about professional development. Were they interested in it? Had they received it? Did they feel like it was useful? And so we were looking at 6 elementary schools from 2 districts. One was a large suburban district in the northeastern United States, and the other was a large, mostly urban district in the mid-Atlantic region. And we had 3 schools from each district, and all of the students, which was pretty amazing, with a few exceptions, all of the students in grades 2, 3, 4, and 5 participated in the study. But because it was a longitudinal study, I focused on grades 3 through 5, because that's when I kind of came into the project. And so there were 51 teachers that completed my survey, which I think represented something like a 92% response rate. I harassed them and bribed them with cookies. I won't lie. I tried not to harass them, but I did bring them cookies and come see them and ask them to complete my survey, so they did. Almost everybody did. And then we had 187 language minority learners who participated in the Clavis project during 2010-2011 when we were collecting data from the teachers. And so the students were given assessments on vocabulary and reading comprehension in the fall and the spring. And the teachers were given their survey in April of 2011. And I collected them from the teachers in May and June of 2011. And so all the student measures were double scored by both me and the other members of my research team, and all the Clavis teacher surveys were reviewed by me and the other members of my team. We used ordinary least squares regression to analyze the student and teacher data. And so in each analysis that we did, students' post-test scores were used as a dependent variable, and pre-test scores were used as independent variables, and then we added in the remaining independent variables hierarchically so we could try to control for each variable and see how the individual variable looked with the other ones removed, or controlled for the other variables, if that makes sense. I'm not explaining that very well. So here's what we found. So we looked at vocabulary, and we found that students' pretest scores, okay, this was the regression analysis. I'm not explaining this very well. So we looked at teacher background factors and student outcomes, and these are the regressions that we ran with the dependent and independent variables. And okay, here's what we found. Experience teaching at the pre-K 6 level had a positive relationship with student outcomes and beliefs about school support. So when we ask questions about, do you feel like you're supported in your school in your work with language minority learners? Are you getting the help that you need? Is there a teacher in the school who you can go to? Is there an expert you can ask? Teachers who said that they had that support actually had kids who did worse in their classrooms, and we had some ideas about why that might be, but we were pretty surprised to find that. The more teaching experience teachers had, the better the language minority learners did in their classrooms. And so, what else did we find? I think I skipped something. Oh, rats. Okay. And so we were wondering why was teaching at the K-6 level related to vocabulary and not comprehension in terms of a positive outcome. And one thing that we speculated was that they were using a really structured vocabulary program that the teachers were trained in extensively before they were asked to use it with their students. And so we thought maybe the more years that they'd used it, the better they were at teaching it. And we thought maybe that teachers who felt like there were lots of resources in their school felt less responsible for the ELLs in their classroom. And so that's why when they said, yeah, I have a lot of support in the school, we have lots of resources for our language minority learners, that their students did worse. We didn't know. Something we want to look into further. So when we looked at reading comprehension, we found that the more preparation teachers reported having working with language minority learners, whether they had a degree in that particular area or whether they'd been attending professional development, the more prepared they felt and said that they were, the better their students did. And we also found that there was a statistically significant outcome on attitudes toward the inclusion of language minority learners. So if they said that they were happy that the students were in their classroom basically and felt that that's where they belonged and that's where they should be, then their students did better. So in looking at the research base, we noticed that preparation for working with language minority learner students, the outcomes were similar to studies that had focused on teachers who were prepared to teach specific disciplines. So there was sort of a handful of studies done in the late 80s and early 90s looking at math specifically. That was the most common sort of content area, but what they said was that the more prepared teachers were to teach specific elements of math, the better their students did. And so we're wondering if similar things were happening with our language minority learners, and that if their teachers were more prepared, they did better. But there's actually, we found a large body of research that didn't find that to be true. Teachers who said they were more prepared to teach elementary school, who had master's degrees, things like that, their students didn't do better. So we're still kind of looking into that. And in terms of attitudes toward inclusion, outcomes were similar to studies demonstrating that teachers' beliefs about students' abilities could influence their outcomes. So we had seen research that talked about if teachers believed their kids could do well, their kids tended to do better. And we weren't actually asking questions specific to that. Our questions were much broader than that. We were just asking, do you think language minority learners should be educated in mainstream classrooms, or should they be educated in their own classrooms? Do you feel that it's a burden on you? Basically, we said it a little more gently than that, but do you feel like it creates more work for you to have these students in your classroom? And if teachers responded that no, it doesn't create more work, they belong in my classroom, I want them there, their students did better. And so we're wondering if that is similar to the idea that if teachers believe their students can do well, then they do, generally. But we don't know. And so the next phase of our study is to take a look at trying to figure out why. So we saw that these things were happening, but we didn't actually connect them to specific classroom practices. And the years of the study that have been going on since 2011 have been looking at analyzing basically 3 years of classroom video and trying to figure out what sorts of instructional practices are happening in those classrooms. And so our attempt now is to connect some of those instructional practices to the teachers who had these kids with these better outcomes, and to see if we can identify what do teachers do where their kids do better, and are those same teachers who had more positive attitudes and who had more training, what are the commonalities we can find? So in this study, we only attempted to determine which teacher background and attitudinal factors had relationships to language minority learners' outcomes, but we didn't attempt to explore why. So that's our next step. And we also found that studies that link background factors, beliefs, and attitudes to specific instructional practices aren't there yet necessarily, and so that's what we're going to try to do and are trying to do now in order to help teachers and researchers begin to understand why and how these things are happening. Because for me, that was my big question as somebody who was a classroom teacher with a lot of language minority learners. What was I doing that was helping? What wasn't helping? And were my attitudes and preparation influencing what I was doing in the classroom in ways that I could see and in ways that maybe I couldn't see? So that's why I went back and got a PhD in the first place, because I felt like I didn't know as much as I should about how to teach those kids. And so that was where the question came from, and we're still looking at answers. So that's my study. Do you have any questions? Anything I know I kind of buzzed through the stats part. If you have more questions about the analyses we did, be happy to answer them, or anything else. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah. That would be great. Thank you.
And it is interesting, that inverse relationship. I just heard my study, I mentioned yesterday, talked about how people, it was on prayer, what if prayer working on, and also did studies on that. So actually people that knew that they were being prayed for did worse in this one big study. And they were trying to figure out why, why would knowing that you were being prayed for result in a worse outcome, sort of counterintuitive. And part of it, so there's the sense of, oh, well, if I was being prayed for, maybe I'm really in bad shape. So I don't know if there's a sense of, if I have all this support, then my students
And they're
And
not?
how is that thinking involved in, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question because you would think that the two things would go together.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is this is not the only example where our intuition and what we see don't match up.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I was shocked by that. And just anecdotally talking to a couple teachers about it, they seem to have an opinion in this classrooms where the students didn't do as well, that those weren't their kids and they didn't belong in their classroom. And so they were like, yeah, we have lots of ELL teachers and these kids should be with them. And so I think maybe the questions I was asking on the survey kind of were being interpreted by those teachers as I was sort of asking, what kind of support do you have? Those sorts of questions, but I think I needed to ask a question about how do you use that support? How do you work with that person? Because it seemed like their thought then was that because we have all this support, why are those kids with me? They shouldn't be. They should be with those teachers that we have. Yeah, it's someone else's, so I'm not gonna work with them while they're here. And I definitely saw, because I was a grad student on this project for several years, and so I was in the classrooms collecting data, and there were teachers who sat their ELLs at a table in the back of the room all day long and didn't never talk to them and just waited for the ELL teacher to come take them out or put them with language training programs with headphones on, but didn't actually try to teach them any of the content of the class and all this heartbreaking stuff that as the observer you're not allowed to say anything about. But yeah, so I wonder if that's part of what was going on, but I would love to dig a little deeper and see. And there's definitely a body of special ed research that I was looking at that kind of had similar findings where the teachers were saying these teachers don't belong in my classroom. They should be with the special ed teachers, and then those students did much more poorly than the teachers who said, yeah, we welcome them, we want them here, and I will adapt my instruction to help. So I don't know, it's really interesting. I'm excited to do some more digging and see what I can find. Right, and instructional practices, and how conscious are they of it? I don't know. And so I was wondering about that as a teacher myself, like how conscious was I of what I was doing or not doing to help those kids in my class? Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
Yeah. I know very, very little about this, but I've heard about some maybe pilot programs where they'll have a classroom that's specifically, half language minority, like maybe Spanish speaking, and half English speaking, to try and disrupt the sense of the
otherness.
In the classroom.
Yeah.
Or even this year, just personally, several friends, they're preschoolers in the county preschools here in the area, where the preschool class is really geared towards preschoolers with developmental delays, but they are mainstreaming in a certain way by bringing in preschoolers without developmental delays. So it's the normal preschoolers who are the minority in the classroom.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
so far they love it.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about what you were saying about that feeling of, this belongs in the classroom, this student is not part of my regular class. If you know anything about, or if anyone knows anything about the theory or the research that's going into these pilot programs that are really trying to turn these models inside out.
Yeah, I don't know much, but I'd like to know more. And as we're talking about this, I'm realizing something I meant to say, so thank you, that something I need to do before we send this out for publication, something that I didn't look at with the data, was what was the proportion of ELLs to non-ELLs in the classroom, because they were required to have at least 20% to participate in the study, but some of them had 20%, some of them had 50%, some had 80%, and I'm assuming, even though we didn't look at it specifically, that that would have an impact too. So, because if they're 80%, then you're not the other. It is, yeah. And we talk so much about differentiation in all of our classes, but what that looked like for the mainstream teachers that I was working with was dramatically different and it wasn't always depending on how many ELLs were in their class, it was just sort of depending on what their idea of differentiation was. So how do you help different kids? How do you group them for instruction? I saw many different things. And so I'm really curious too now to go back and try to connect numbers of ELLs, instructional practices that we saw, attitudinal, dispositional things, and see if there are patterns that we can identify. So that's going to be my work for the next couple of years, I think, because it's a huge data set. But it's interesting stuff. And what I found too was that I didn't actually see any research that had shown that when teachers are better prepared to work with ELLs, their ELLs do better. There just didn't seem to be any. And so it was good to, intuitively that makes total sense, but I couldn't actually find a study that showed that. I found several that showed that it didn't make any difference, that training didn't matter. And so that's my other question is, why did their training matter? And why did we find that outcome when other people weren't finding that outcome? So lots of big questions. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Any other questions? Anything else I can tell you about? Oh. Yeah, more coffee, more food. I can finally look at this study again after 2 years without cringing. At first I had to put it away for a while, so thank you very much.